It was a peaceful afternoon in the park. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the grass. Maya Williams, a woman in her late 30s, sat on a bench, enjoying the brief respite from her busy life. She held a coffee cup in one hand, her phone in the other, scrolling through emails. The air was crisp, and the park was quiet, just the kind of place she needed to clear her head. Suddenly, a voice broke the calm. "What do you think you're doing here?" It was loud and authoritative, cutting through the peaceful ambiance like a sharp knife. Maya looked up, startled, to see a tall man in a uniform walking toward her. His face was stern, his eyes piercing. Confusion flickered across Maya's face. She wasn't used to being confronted in such a way, but she quickly regained her composure. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steady, though tinged with disbelief. "I said, what are you doing here? Do you belong here?" The officer's voice was sharp, and his hand hovered over his belt, where his badge gleamed in the sunlight. Maya was taken aback. She tried to stay calm, but the officer's hostile demeanor made it difficult. "I'm just sitting here for a moment," she said, trying to diffuse the situation. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's gaze narrowed. "Show me some ID," he demanded. The request was laced with contempt. Maya's brows furrowed in confusion. "What for? I'm not doing anything wrong." "You're loitering," he snapped. "I've seen people like you around here before, always causing trouble." Maya's heart raced. The officer's words stung, and she felt a rush of indignation. She wasn't the first person to be treated like this, but it didn't make it any easier to handle. "What do you mean, people like me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The officer smirked. "You know exactly what I mean. You think you can just walk into any neighborhood and act like you belong here?" Maya stood her ground, though her breath caught in her throat. "I don't have to explain myself to you. I have every right to be here." The officer's face twisted into a sneer. "We'll see about that," he muttered, pulling out a radio and calling for backup. The tension in the air grew thick as the second officer arrived. He was a stocky man, looking uncomfortable as he surveyed the situation. He glanced at the first officer, clearly unsure about how to proceed. The first officer, Darren, gave him a curt nod, and the second officer reluctantly stepped forward. Maya, still standing her ground, refused to be intimidated. "You're harassing me for no reason," she said, her voice strong. "You have no right to treat me like this." The second officer hesitated, glancing at Darren, who was now visibly frustrated. Darren's patience was wearing thin, and his words became more aggressive. "I told you not to move," he barked, his hand still resting near his belt, the threat of violence looming in the air. Maya didn't flinch. "I know my rights. I don't have to show you anything." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing from Maya to Darren. He knew this was a tense situation, but it wasn't until Darren raised his voice again that the full scale of the moment became clear. "I'm arresting you for obstruction," Darren shouted. "You're not following my orders." Maya's frustration boiled over, and she finally spoke out, her voice cutting through the tension. "I won't tolerate this," she said firmly. "You don't have the right to treat me this way." As the confrontation in the park escalated, Maya's thoughts flickered back to her earlier years, the journey that had led her to this moment. She was no stranger to adversity. As a black woman in the predominantly white world of law enforcement, she had faced countless challenges. From the moment she had joined the police force, she had been determined to pave a path for others who looked like her, to break down the barriers that had kept people like her out of positions of power. Maya was not just a woman sitting in a park, trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon. She was the deputy chief of police, the first black woman to hold such a high-ranking position in her department. The path to leadership had not been easy, and she had fought every step of the way against biases, both overt and subtle. She had earned her place, but the fight wasn't over. Every day was another reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Her mother, an elementary school teacher, had instilled in her a strong sense of justice and fairness, but she had also taught her something even more important: treat everyone with respect, especially when they don't show it back. Maya had taken those words to heart. It was this philosophy that had shaped her decisions and fueled her passion for reform. She had seen how systemic bias had shaped her own life and career, and it was why she had worked tirelessly to bring change to the department. But the toll of constantly battling against ingrained prejudice weighed heavily on her. In the workplace, Maya had often faced dismissive comments, being treated as though she didn't belong, even by her own colleagues. It was exhausting, but Maya was resolute. She knew that the work she was doing wasn't just for her, it was for the future. For those who would follow in her footsteps. For the community she served. This was the context that fueled her drive as the investigation into Darren Mitchell continued to unfold. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity, she was fighting to change the culture of an entire institution. This was bigger than one man. This was about the future of law enforcement. As the days passed, Darren began to realize the gravity of his mistake. What had started as a routine encounter in the park was now spiraling out of control. The call for backup had brought more officers to the scene, and the situation was no longer just about a minor confrontation. It was becoming a public spectacle, and Darren could feel the weight of the consequences pressing down on him. What Darren hadn't realized in the heat of the moment was that the woman he had confronted was not just some random person sitting in the park. Maya Williams was the deputy chief of police, a trailblazer in a department that had been resistant to change. He hadn't recognized her, hadn't made the connection until the moment it was too late. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had mistreated someone with more power than he had ever imagined. Maya wasn't just a civilian, she was the one person who had the authority to bring his entire career crashing down. And that's exactly what she was doing. He had crossed a line. And now there was no going back. Darren spent sleepless nights replaying the events of that day. He had been so caught up in his own biases, so certain that he was in the right, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had abused his power. And now it was too late to undo the damage. Maya, meanwhile, was already moving forward with the investigation. She wasn't going to let Darren's actions slide. The system that had allowed him to continue unchecked was broken, and it was time to fix it. The days that followed were filled with tension as Maya continued to push forward with the investigation into Darren's actions. She wasn't going to let it slide, not this time. She had seen firsthand the way officers like Darren were able to misuse their power. Shielded by the system that had protected them for so long. Now, it was time to hold Darren accountable, not just for his actions that day, but for years of misconduct that had gone unnoticed. Maya's office was a flurry of activity. She spent long hours reviewing old files, pulling up reports from citizens who had filed complaints about Darren's behavior in the past. Complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and inappropriate conduct. Each one had been dismissed or ignored by his superiors. The weight of it all bore down on Maya. But she knew this was bigger than just Darren. This was about the culture within the department. A culture that had allowed people like him to operate with impunity. With the support of a few colleagues who shared her vision of reform, Maya began the slow process of gathering evidence. Internal affairs was brought into the fold, and the wheels of justice, however slow, began to turn. Darren, meanwhile, remained unaware of the full extent of what Maya was doing behind the scenes. He thought the issue would blow over. He was wrong. Maya was determined to ensure that this investigation wasn't just a one-off. She had a vision of a department that would hold its officers accountable. A department where transparency and justice would no longer be optional. Days after the confrontation, Darren found himself staring at the walls of his apartment, unable to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His mind replayed the incident in the park. The way things had spiraled out of control so quickly. At first, he had been so sure of himself, he had followed procedure. He had done his job. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just about Maya, it was about everything he had been blind to all these years. The way he had dismissed people based on their appearance. The way he had let his biases dictate his actions. Darren had grown up believing that authority was absolute. That his badge gave him the right to do whatever was necessary to keep order. But now, he began to see the cracks in that belief. His actions had consequences, and those consequences were just beginning to unfold. The weight of the situation was sinking in, and he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. The idea of facing those consequences terrified him, but at the same time, a part of him knew he had to. The path to redemption wouldn't be easy, but it was the only path forward. As the days turned into weeks, Darren tried to make sense of everything. He started reflecting on his past actions, confronting the uncomfortable truth about his own biases. He began to see how his behavior had affected not just Maya, but so many others. For the first time in his life, Darren was forced to truly acknowledge his mistakes. The investigation into Darren's conduct moved forward swiftly. The department, now under public scrutiny, had no choice but to act. Darren was placed on administrative leave while Internal Affairs conducted a thorough review of his past actions. What they uncovered was nothing short of damning. Years of misconduct, complaints that had been ignored, and a pattern of abusive behavior emerged. Darren had been allowed to continue for so long because no one had bothered to hold him accountable. But now, the tide was turning. The department, under Maya's leadership, faced mounting pressure to deal with Darren's actions. The public outcry was impossible to ignore. Darren was no longer just a rogue officer, he had become a symbol of the systemic issues that plagued the department. And as the investigation moved forward, it was clear that his career was coming to an end. For Darren, the realization that his career was over was crushing. He had worked his entire life to get to this point, and now it was slipping through his fingers. The mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt, they were all catching up with him. But for Maya, this was just the beginning. She wasn't going to stop until real change had been made. Darren's fall from grace was just the first step in a much larger fight for justice and accountability within the department. As the investigation into Darren Mitchell progressed, the pressure on Maya grew. She was in the spotlight, leading a critical effort to hold Darren accountable, and by extension, to address the deeply rooted issues in the police department. But despite the public support for her efforts, there were still those within the department who were resistant to change. Maya had been a symbol of reform since the moment she had risen to her position. And now, her leadership was being tested more than ever. In her office, Maya spent long hours reviewing reports, strategizing with Internal Affairs, and preparing for the difficult conversations ahead. She was committed to ensuring that Darren's actions would not be swept under the rug. No matter how much opposition she faced, there were whispers around the precinct about her efforts. Some officers questioning her methods and her authority. But Maya stood firm, knowing that her mission was more important than maintaining her position or keeping the peace. She was determined to change the culture that had allowed officers like Darren to flourish unchecked. This was not just about one bad officer, it was about an entire system that had been complicit in perpetuating injustice. Maya's efforts were setting a precedent. Her refusal to back down was making waves, both within the department and the community. It was no longer just about Darren Mitchell, it was about holding every officer to the same standard of accountability. Maya continued to meet resistance, both in the department and in the community. Some people resented her push for reform, seeing it as a threat to the traditional ways of policing. But Maya was undeterred. She was clear about her vision. The department needed to reflect the community it served, and that meant holding officers accountable, making the necessary changes, and ensuring transparency in every process. She received numerous letters and messages of support from citizens who had witnessed Darren's abuse of power. From people who had felt victimized by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. Their voices, alongside her own, kept her focused. This fight was bigger than her. After everything had begun to unravel for Darren, and with the internal investigation closing in, he realized that he needed to make amends for his past actions. Though his career in law enforcement had likely come to an end, he still had a chance to do something positive with his life moving forward. He began to reflect on the years of biased behavior, the countless instances where he had abused his power. Darren had never truly thought about the impact of his actions until now. The realization that he had caused harm, not just to Maya but to so many others, weighed heavily on him. In an effort to atone for his mistakes, Darren started volunteering at a local youth center. He worked with at-risk teenagers, sharing his story and helping them understand the importance of staying on the right path. For Darren, this was an uncomfortable but necessary step. It wasn't enough to just regret his actions, he had to actively contribute to repairing the damage he had caused. Volunteering at the center was a challenge for Darren. He wasn't used to being vulnerable. And he wasn't sure what kind of impact he could have. But he persevered. As he interacted with the young people at the center, he began to understand the depth of the bias that had shaped his own views. He listened to their stories, learned about their struggles, and realized how much his past actions had contributed to a system that hurt people like them. Darren understood now that his redemption wasn't about earning back his job or gaining approval. It was about becoming a better person, someone who could contribute positively to the community. This realization marked the beginning of his long journey toward personal transformation. Maya's actions sparked a ripple effect throughout the department, one that began to reverberate beyond the walls of the precinct. As the investigation into Darren Mitchell unfolded, officers who had once turned a blind eye to systemic issues were now confronted with the reality of their own biases and behaviors. The transparency that Maya demanded created a new level of accountability that many had never experienced before. She wasn't just holding Darren accountable, she was setting a precedent for how the entire department would be expected to act moving forward. It wasn't an easy transition. At first, many officers resisted the changes. The culture of silence and complacency ran deep, and the idea of holding their peers accountable was a bitter pill to swallow. But slowly, as more officers witnessed the consequences of Darren's actions and the changes brought about by Maya's leadership, they began to understand something fundamental: accountability was not a weakness, but a strength. It strengthened their role as protectors of the community, not enforcers of an outdated and harmful system. Maya, ever determined, knew this process wouldn't happen overnight. She continued to push for reform, knowing that it would take years to truly change the culture within the department. But each step forward, no matter how small, felt like progress. She held town hall meetings, engaged with the community, and worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they swore to serve. With each passing day, she could feel the shift. A slow but steady change that would eventually leave its mark on the department and the city as a whole. Meanwhile, Darren's journey of redemption continued in a much different arena. As part of his efforts to make amends, he volunteered at a local youth center, working with at-risk teens who, like him, had been impacted by a system that too often overlooked them. Initially, it had been a way for him to do something that could begin to balance out the weight of his past mistakes. But as he spent more time with the kids, he began to see the deeper, systemic issues that he had once perpetuated. The same biases he had held onto for so long had seeped into the very fabric of his work. And now, seeing it from the other side, he couldn't ignore the harm it caused. Each conversation he had with the teens, each story they shared, began to dismantle the defenses he had built over the years. They talked about their experiences with law enforcement, how they had been treated with suspicion simply because of the neighborhood they lived in or the color of their skin. Darren realized the full scope of the damage he had contributed to. And while it was difficult to face, it was the first step in his long road toward understanding. He couldn't undo the damage, but he could work to ensure that the future was different. In these moments of reflection and growth, Darren understood that his redemption wasn't just about doing the right thing in the community. It was about doing the hard work of confronting his past actions and the system he had once been a part of. For both Maya and Darren, their journeys were just beginning. Maya's steadfast commitment to reform and justice was reshaping the future of law enforcement in their city, while Darren's commitment to understanding his own biases was laying the foundation for personal change. It wasn't a quick fix, and it wasn't easy, but in the quiet progress they each made, they both understood that change, like ripples in water, started small and would grow into something much bigger than themselves. Months passed after Darren Mitchell's public disgrace. The investigation into his conduct had not only led to his suspension but also had sparked a much-needed discussion within the department and the community about systemic issues and the importance of accountability in law enforcement. For Darren, however, the consequences of his actions were not just about losing his badge. It was about coming to terms with the kind of person he had been. And more importantly, the person he wanted to become. Darren's path to redemption was not quick, nor was it easy. He spent a considerable amount of time volunteering at youth centers, working with young people who had been impacted by the very system he had once upheld without question. Slowly, He began to understand the weight of his mistakes. And even though he knew he could never fully undo the harm he had caused, he was committed to atoning for his actions in whatever way he could. One day, Darren decided to write a letter to Maya. He had been carrying the weight of guilt for months, and though he knew there was no way she would forgive him immediately, he felt a deep need to express his remorse. He penned down the words with care, acknowledging the pain his actions had caused her and the community, and he vowed to continue working on himself. In the letter, Darren didn't ask for forgiveness. He understood that Maya had every right to be angry with him, and that his actions had been unforgivable in many ways. But he did offer a sincere apology and expressed his commitment to making amends. He shared the work he had been doing in the community and how it had shifted his perspective. It wasn't just about checking a box or seeking redemption. It was about learning, understanding, and taking responsibility. The letter was not a quick fix for Darren, and Maya knew that. But she appreciated the effort. While she didn't offer immediate forgiveness, she understood the importance of the step Darren had taken. The letter represented more than just an apology, it represented the beginning of Darren's journey toward personal transformation. For Maya, it was a reminder that change, even when slow, was possible. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about moving forward and creating a better future. She kept the letter, though she didn't know exactly what to do with it. It was a small but significant gesture, and she knew it would be part of Darren's larger process of growth. On a warm, sunny afternoon in a quiet neighborhood park, 16-year-old Brielle Adams sat at a picnic table, diligently working on a history assignment. Her laptop sat in front of her, papers scattered across the table as she typed away, her focus absolute. The park around her was peaceful, with families strolling by, and children playing nearby, but Brielle, a black teenager, was not given the same peace. A middle-aged man, Gerald Whitmore, sat on a nearby bench, his sharp gaze fixed on Brielle. Something about her presence caught his attention, though she was doing nothing wrong. Brielle had been sitting at the table for some time, absorbed in her work, and yet Gerald found himself growing increasingly uneasy. She didn't belong here, not in his eyes. He watched her closely, every movement seeming suspicious to him, even though there was no reason to be suspicious. His discomfort turned into judgment, and before long, his finger hovered over the number on his phone. Gerald had seen this girl sitting alone for a while. It was odd. It didn't feel right, so he made the call to the police. It was subtle, racially motivated, but he didn't see it that way. He was simply looking out for the community. He told himself, I don't know what she's doing here, but something doesn't feel right. He muttered as he dialed the police, his voice laced with unease. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the calm of the park. Brielle was still absorbed in her work, oblivious to the incoming officers. The first police car pulled up in front of the park bench, followed by another. Brielle's heart skipped a beat as the officers stepped out, their eyes immediately locking onto her. The first officer, tall and lean, walked toward her confidently. His face was cold, uninviting. Excuse me, miss, he said, his tone flat but authoritative. Can I ask what you're doing here? Brielle blinked in confusion, taking out an earbud from one of her ears. Homework, she said, gesturing to the laptop and the papers on the table in front of her. The second officer, stockier and more rigid, stood back by the patrol car, his eyes scanning the area. He looked tense, ready to react at any moment, his hand hovering near his belt. Brielle's unease grew with every second, her mind racing. She didn't understand why they were questioning her, especially since she hadn't done anything wrong. We got a call about a suspicious person in the park, the first officer continued, looking her up and down. You've been here for a while. Brielle frowned, her confusion turning into discomfort. I'm doing homework. I've been here for a while because I'm working on an assignment. What's the problem? The second officer's gaze was hard, unyielding. His stance didn't help ease Brielle's anxiety. Got any ID? He asked abruptly. Brielle hesitated. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she reached for her bag. What for? She asked, her voice shaking a little. The first officer didn't seem to notice her discomfort. He stood with his arms crossed, waiting for her response. Routine check, he said, though his tone suggested it was far from routine. At that moment, Brielle realized that she was being singled out, not because of her behavior, but because of how she looked. She had been to this park many times before, sitting at these very tables, and never had she been asked for identification. She understood now that the reason she was being questioned had more to do with her race than anything else. Her fingers gripped the handle of her wallet, slowly pulling it out as she prepared to hand over her ID. Her movements were deliberate, careful. She knew that any sudden action could be misinterpreted, but before she could react further, an unexpected sound broke through the tension in the air. Just as Brielle was about to hand over her ID, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the park. A woman in a navy blue blazer stepped out, Olivia Barrett. Brielle's mother. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she walked toward the scene, her presence commanding attention. "Officers," she said, her voice calm but firm, as she approached the two officers. "Is there a problem here?" The first officer turned to face her, his posture stiffening as if he wasn't expecting this intervention. "Ma'am, we received a report about a suspicious individual in the park. We were just questioning her," he explained, his tone still somewhat guarded. Olivia's gaze turned from the officers to Brielle, then back to the officers. "A suspicious individual?" she repeated, her voice cool but laced with disbelief. What crime was she committing? The second officer shifted uncomfortably. He started. But Olivia interrupted. "Do you have a problem with my daughter sitting in a public park doing her homework?" she asked pointedly. The officers exchanged a glance. Olivia's presence had shifted the balance of power, and they seemed to realize they had made a mistake. The first officer, clearly trying to regain control, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we were just following protocol," he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. Olivia's eyes narrowed. "This is not protocol. This is racial profiling." Olivia Barrett's sharp gaze shifted to Gerald Whitmore, who was still sitting at the park bench. Trying to avoid the growing tension, she marched toward him with a purposeful stride, every step filled with the quiet intensity of someone who knew exactly what needed to be said. Gerald, sensing the focus shifting to him, finally looked up, his face reddening as he realized he was about to become the subject of this confrontation. "Did you call the police?" Olivia asked, her voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge. Gerald swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the park. But he knew there was no escaping the situation now. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, his hands instinctively clutching the phone in his lap as if it could protect him from the consequences of his actions. "I just thought," she looked out of place. Olivia's eyes narrowed as she stood directly in front of him, her presence commanding. "Looked out of place?" she repeated, almost incredulously. "What do you mean by that, Gerald? Because she's sitting here, doing homework? What exactly did she do that made you think she didn't belong?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably on the bench, his face reddening further as Olivia's words pierced through the thin veneer of his excuses. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The weight of his assumptions about Brielle, based purely on her race and his perception of the situation, hung heavily in the air. "You saw my daughter," Olivia continued, her voice now tinged with cold fury. "And you decided that she didn't belong here simply because she's a black teenager. Sitting in a park. That's not just a mistake, Gerald. That's the problem with how people like you view young black people every single day. You don't see them as individuals, you see them as threats. And you act on that bias." Gerald opened his mouth to speak again, but Olivia's gaze stopped him. "You made Brielle feel like she was doing something wrong. You called the police because you were uncomfortable with the idea of her. A young black girl, sitting alone in a public space. How do you think that makes her feel?" For the first time, Gerald looked down at his hands, no longer able to make eye contact with Olivia. He could feel the weight of his actions crashing down on him. But the full reality of what he had done seemed to escape him. Olivia took a step back, her expression a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. "You disrupted her peaceful afternoon. And for what? Your own discomfort? Do you realize how much harm that kind of thinking causes?" she asked, her voice softer but no less intense. With no further words from Gerald, Olivia turned back to the officers. "This is what happens when you don't question your own biases. You treat people unfairly, And you justify it to yourselves by telling yourselves it's for the good of the community. Well, I'm here to tell you that you've hurt the community instead. She turned and placed a hand on Brielle's shoulder, offering her silent support, before speaking again. This isn't just about Brielle. This is about the larger problem of racial profiling and how it perpetuates harm to innocent people. And it's about time we started having these difficult conversations. As the officers slowly retreated, their heads lowered in acknowledgement of their mistake, Brielle stood quietly, her mother's firm stance beside her offering an unexpected sense of reassurance. The initial sting of humiliation was still there, but Brielle now felt something else, strength. The courage her mother had displayed in confronting the officers, and the way she had articulated their biases so sharply, made Brielle feel seen. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just a victim of the situation, she was a part of a larger movement against injustice. She took a deep breath and glanced at her mother, who was now watching the officers as they walked away, their heads down in embarrassment. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked softly, her voice gentle yet still filled with strength. Brielle nodded, but her expression was serious. "Yeah, just a little shaken up." Olivia smiled softly and placed her hand on Brielle's shoulder. "It's okay to be shaken up. What happened today, it's just one small part of a much bigger problem. But you have the power to change it. To stand up for yourself. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Brielle's mind raced with the weight of her mother's words. What had happened wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue, systemic racism that had been normalized for far too long. She didn't want to feel afraid, but the truth was hard to ignore. But Brielle knew one thing for sure, her mother's unwavering support had given her a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was a fight worth continuing.